I worked for Herman Sarkowsky and Dick Verlieb, two very big sports powerhouses in Seattle. They had a venture capital company, and I worked for them. One of the things they were interested in, primarily because of Lamar Hunt, was in bringing a soccer franchise to Seattle. Lamar had the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL, but he also had the Dallas Tornado in the North American Soccer League. And he was an important cog in both of those sports. And Lamar took on the task of trying to get people to buy franchises in soccer, in the North American Soccer League. So he was friends with Herman and Ned Skinner, another one of the original owners. And so he kind of spoke to them about bringing this in. The fact that he was also on the expansion committee of the NFL was probably motivation for them to give a shot at soccer. But they were the city fathers. Those people, Herman Sarkowsky, Ned Skinner, Monty Bean, Howie Wright, and Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Elmer Nordstrom. That group of people was very much what you used to call the city fathers. And they had brought the World's Fair here, and they had great vision for making Seattle Major League. Eventually, they wanted an NFL franchise. There's no question about it. But this was a nice little way to put their toes in the water, and they were doing something for Lamar. So I was working for them, and they talked about this franchise, and then they got it, and then they interviewed for the coach. So I met John the very first day he came to town, which is quite fateful. And I don't believe they interviewed anyone else. He had come recommended highly by Lamar Hunt, who owned the Dallas Tornado, because John had gone out in Dallas, which was American football crazy, and instigated soccer at the grassroots level. And Lamar was so impressed by that. So he recommended John. John came for the interview. He was hired. I think they talked to Cliff McGrath, maybe got his opinion, but not as an interview, but just his opinion. And John was hired. So Walter Daggett was the managing partner, named the managing partner. Walter came out of Ned Skinner's organization. And that's how I first knew about soccer. I went on to be the first employee of the Seattle Seahawks when we got the NFL franchise. So I started in NFL, and I was the first Seahawk employee. And so I think just because there was no one else there but me, they would come talk to me periodically, the press. In there, and you're right, there was no women, no women in professional sports then that I knew of. Well, there was tennis players, but none in the front office. And in this article, they must have asked me what my goals were in sports, and I actually said in this article that I thought I could replace Pete Rozelle as commissioner of the NFL. I was so embarrassed, and me and my niece, we just laughed our heads off. But anyway, I loved sports my whole life, and to get a job in sports was, to me, the greatest. I was often the only woman, and certainly when I went up into management, I was the only woman I eventually got on some league committees and stuff. I was always the only woman. I loved working for John, and we worked very well together. We were good yin and yang, and strengths and opportunities, we've meshed well. But John, to me, I did not ride John's coattails into a career in professional sports. It was often portrayed that way, and there's nothing I could do about it because I was married to him. But I never thought that. He never thought that. The ownership never thought that. And anyone that knew me didn't think that. But you have to live with it. There's more in now, and it's probably not so usual. The thing that used to bug me the most was whenever there was, once I got into soccer and there was any interest from the media in my story, or even if I got mentioned in a John story, they would always put in parentheses, Mrs. John Best, or married to John Best, or something like that. They would not say John Best, oh, married to Claudia. No, they would, but just could not leave it alone. That bugged me, but nothing I could do about it. I just know what my contribution was, and I know what our work relationship was, and I'm very pleased with both of those things. He chose good scouts, people who he thought knew how to analyze the player's strengths and weaknesses, somebody who really understands soccer, people who either played or were coaches, so he had a good scouting network wherever he went. He would travel a lot to see players play and sit with those scouts, and they would talk it over, and they would say yes and no. John was a very persuasive person, as you well know, and you know, he could paint a picture that was attractive to those guys. He wasn't plucking them out of the Premier League. These were in the Champions League. I don't even think it was called that during those years, but it was the level under the Premier League, no matter what country. And these players would become anxious to be chosen and come over here. Because John could paint a great picture, and he wasn't known to be a person who didn't execute on what he said. So the players wanted to come here, and then of course they heard those players went back and they said, "Oh my gosh, it's so wonderful, and America is lovely, and John's a great coach," and all this kind of stuff. So then that was the network that spread. So he only played for Liverpool, I think, for 3 years when he was 16, 17, 18. So, and then he went and played for Tranmere before he came here. So it wasn't like he was bringing a big player rep to, they don't care that he was a Dallas Tornado NASL All-Star. That's what? But he was a very persuasive person. He loved the sport. They could tell that. And he was smart. He knew what he was doing. You know, they couldn't BS him. So I believe that he made it very attractive for them, and then he never let them down. You know how many of them stayed in all 3 of the different franchises, and I think that was true in Dallas, too. John and I and Jimmy and Pat were the best of friends for a long, long time, and I am still very close to both Jimmy and Pat. Jimmy was the perfect choice. Again, I know I keep using the puzzle, but that was a critical piece of the puzzle. Maybe people didn't appreciate as much. He was a perfect assistant coach. He was a perfect guy to be in the community. He was a good player. Jimmy was a very good player. Had the excellent attention and respect from the players. Wonderful compliment to John as a head coach. They just like John and Tony eventually. Tony being the coach and John being the president, but still the same dynamic, perfect for each other. Jimmy, I think, was meant to be an assistant coach. I think that was the perfect place for him. I was proud of him and pleased for him when he became head coach. It was a logical, it was the bench moving up, and that was perfect. I don't think he was ever as happy as a head coach as he was when he was working with John and still playing. I think that was his perfect spot. Jimmy might think that now too. I don't know. But he was just critical to the whole first 3 years of the Sounders. In Seattle, it was minuscule. But because I was with John, I got to I got to see these people that stepped forward, and they were Walter Schmitzer, and they were Denzel, and it was Whitey Craig, and it was Cliff McGrath, and probably others that I should say that I can't remember, but it was very, very small. And they opened the doors they could, but they didn't have a whole lot of doors to open either. I have to say that I believe the Sounders' early success and continually through the 3 years that John was there was due in most part to people who didn't have anything to do with soccer before, but they were loyal to and wanted to support the desires of that ownership group. If you take a Nordstrom and a Sarkowsky and a Ned Skinner times their network, you got a big number. And that when there was 12,000 some on the first game to a Memorial Stadium and none of us knew what was going to happen, I would say 90-some% of those were because Herman said to all his 100 people who could afford season tickets, I'd really like it if you got to, so for Seattle, yeah, those pioneer guys were there. John immediately honored them and did activities with and for them. He knew how valuable they were. But I really think in Seattle, the ownership group was the key. In Vancouver, very different. Quite a large soccer community, but all ethnic. So the Croatians had their soccer, and the British people had theirs, and the Scottish people had theirs, and on, but a bigger number. A lot of people plugged in up there. The Lenarduzzi family, which Bobby's still the president of the Whitecaps, and Sammy and Danny both worked there. They were a well-known family, and they had a big influence. And a lot of the Canadian players, remember back in those days, we were legislated to have X number of native players. You got a far higher degree of skill from the Canadian than you did from the American, just because of the development of the sport, because it was such a cosmopolitan city. It had more soccer going on by far. But there were similar people up there. John just, he loved the supporters clubs. He loved that kind of thing, and they would fan the flames. So up in Vancouver, a little bit different. Tacoma, well, by the time we got to Tacoma, the Sounders had been in effect for many years, and so they had a clue. But again, we were doing indoor soccer. There was no network at all. So we basically had to create that one. Well, I think he knew the market. And, those guys were very attractive to us with their English accents, and at that time they had their long hair, and they were in great shape, and they were available to interface with. I mean, pretty much the fact that they were attractive to the female population had as much to do with the players as it did with the game. But, of course, then they began to love the game. I think women know more about soccer than any other sport in America. Now, obviously, that wasn't true in Britain. I remember going to a Tottenham game, and at halftime, I was not allowed to go in and have the tea. And there was no seats. There were seats because I was in a box, but there was no other seats. They were all men. Very different. But John was, very astute in looking at what he had to work with, and I think he always emphasized the attractiveness of the game in terms of how it appealed to a woman who, by the way, could play. And they wouldn't have to put on great big uniforms or be 6 feet tall or do anything. They could play. So he knew what he was doing, and they were charming. They still are charming guys. Yeah. Well, in terms of the product on the field, how teams that John was associated with played, he was very oriented toward entertaining the fans. His style of play was based on performance as opposed to win-loss record. He elevated players. He was an excellent, not only an excellent recruiter, but he analyzed players correctly in terms of how they would fit together as a team. So the cohesiveness of the team, the puzzle being put together, that was a big strength of his, and he enjoyed that. So, you know, the vision was of entertaining soccer, of getting the players closer to the fans, going into the community, speaking engagements, coaches clinics, players showing up at charity events, John speaking everywhere, us always going to gatherings. So accessibility, so entertaining soccer, accessibility to the players, always thinking of creating history so that when people look back on this, they saw the values of community building and player involvement and competitive, entertaining soccer. He always looked at it from, when you look back on this, what are you going to think? I feel, because of all the people who continually, to this day, whether it's Whitecaps or Sounders or Stars, if I run into someone and they realize that I was involved, what they say is the reward. The players who played for him and the coaches that he chose, they will tell you that that was one of their best times of their playing career. So I would say the biggest beliefs were that to be entertaining to the fans, but all fan-oriented, all community-oriented, building the sense of team in not only the field team, but the community and the team. That was what he was all about, because of where he came from. I guess maybe I would just say I do think that the owners of the teams don't get enough recognition for what they do. Good owners that let you do your job, but put the money in, that use their influence to get people to come, that support you through the tough times. I think our ownership groups were spectacular, maybe with one exception in there. But I think that would be something I would want to emphasize. And then again, I would just say for my John, I think his dream came true. I think he successfully had a huge role in bringing soccer to America. I would just definitely say that we were both divorced with children and had no intention of getting involved with anyone else, but we got involved with each other immediately, and we were married for 40 years. We have 3 children, and there came a time after the first 3 seasons of the Sounders, which, as you may recall, Frank, Hal Childs dubbed Camelot, which was very perfect. After those first 3 awesome seasons, John was going on to the next step of his career, which was management, and he became the general manager of the Vancouver Whitecaps. And I had a choice to make, and I loved my job. I had an awesome job with the Seattle Seahawks, for crying out loud. But I decided I wanted to go with John, and we weren't married at the time. But also, I had really come to love the sport. I was born in America, and I loved American football. I knew nothing about soccer, just like all of us, when he arrived. But his vision, John was a very competitive man, very competitive. He was a professional athlete, 5-time All-Star, very tough-nosed. And so he totally wanted to win every game and win every battle and win every negotiation that he was in. But it wasn't his main motivation for being here and then going to Vancouver. He wanted to bring soccer to America. He came from Liverpool, where you're either red or blue, Everton or Liverpool, and he was all red. But his vision was this amazing, he thought it as just an unbelievable opportunity to come to America and bring this sport that was in his heart. So I loved his motivation. I loved what he did in the community. The people I talk to this day, now what are we talking, since the 73, will tell you that was their best sporting experience those 3 first years. It was because he wanted to grow the sport, so he went into the community. And of course, the ownership group was 100% behind that. That's what they wanted too. So that's how I first knew John. Then I made the decision to give up the NFL and go with John to Vancouver. Vancouver was a very different situation, much more cosmopolitan then, even as kind of it is now. So there was actual roots of soccer in Vancouver, a lot of ethnic soccer. And they had a team, but it just hadn't caught on. They also had an excellent ownership group. The people who owned the Whitecaps were very similar to the people originally owning the Sounders. So they were attracted by John's motivation and they looked at him as a person who had a lot to do with the success Seattle had and Vancouver didn't. So it was very exciting, very exhilarating. When we got there, the players were still working jobs and playing, and you could go play with, for example, the Lenarduzzi brothers. You could go to the park on Sunday and play with them, and then, you know, I think it was not really seen as a professional franchise because everybody was just hanging. And so his job there wasn't so much introduction, it was bringing it up to the professional level. Very exciting. He, much like he did here, he recruited from here it was America and British, there it was Canadian and British. That's what he knew, but he also knew the language was important. If you're trying to get the community to integrate with the players, it helps that they speak the same language. So he was very comfortable with the British players, and the Canadian players were as well. Of course, there was a lot more British people in Vancouver than there was here. So over the period of time he was there, I was the director of operations, he was the general manager president. And the Whitecaps just became an extremely successful franchise. They won the championship in 1979 with an awesome team. And the parade they had afterwards is still the biggest parade ever in Vancouver. The players, very awesome players, world-class players. Vancouver was competing with the Real Madrids and the, not maybe the Liverpool Man U level, but certainly Premier League teams, and players were choosing Vancouver. So we had an awesome, probably as good a team, and I mean, we played with the Cosmos. I would say the Vancouver teams were probably amongst the best team that ever played in the North American Soccer League. The year after the championship in any sport, but certainly in soccer, nascent as it still was, even though it was so popular, that's an ugly year. All the players are all hyped, and you know, they won the championship, so they're waiting for these huge rewards, and the atmosphere was very difficult. Tony Waiters was the coach there. Tony and John were a great combo, perfectly suited for each other. Big reason we were successful. And so to kind of shield Tony and the owners from the post-championship player uprising, which occurs everywhere, you know, John had to do some tough things. We signed an awesome player, Ruud Krol, and he was highly recruited by the big teams over in Europe, but he wanted to come to Vancouver. And yet, he never gelled with the players that were there that had won the championship. So you started to have erosion on the field. So John took the hit and stepped up and did the things that were difficult to do to try to get it back on track. But he didn't like that. He didn't like the direction that it looked like we were going, and I think he was very tired after that. He really kind of wanted a break. He'd been intensely involved in Dallas, Seattle, Vancouver, and he just wanted to take a break. Also, not to be insulting to you in any way, Frank, but John was very disgusted by the media. The media coverage had turned sensationalistic, and yes, and you know, the coverage when we first came to Seattle, that was a different world. Those writers and the people on TV, they were for the franchise, and they wanted things to go well, and they wrote positive things. They didn't go looking for the guy that was pissed off or whatever. That was in Seattle. It was like that at the beginning in Vancouver because they want the franchise. That's their business. They want the franchise to do well. But of course, it also deteriorated into this time now that is everywhere, which is, you know, disgruntled players talk to the press and the press prints it. In reality, that's what they want because they think that sells more than saying everything is really good on that team and nobody wants to read about it. So I think that was the two things. He was tired. He'd been giving a lot of himself through 3 franchises. He was disgruntled with the media and didn't want to be involved with that sensationalism. So he wanted to take a break. And no thought whatsoever that he would come back and do anything in soccer in Seattle.
Like he might have done with soccer?
He was thinking that. He was thinking that. So we had a couple of years off, a year plus. But then he felt kind of bad about the Sounders because he had left them at a high and they had gone to a low. I think they were drawing literally in the 5s and 6s, and they were in the Kingdom. So he felt bad about that. You know, it mattered to him. Anyway, then there was this effort made by a number of different people to recruit him to come back and maybe right the ship. And the Coluccios wanted him to. We'd had time off. John had refreshed himself. He cared about the Sounders, so he thought he'd do a little stint. He didn't know how long it would be. We didn't foresee the Bruce Anderson ownership years. So he went back in, and, you know, he did well because I think we went to Soccer Bowl that year. That was Kenny Hibbett and all of those guys. We went to Soccer Bowl. I think we lost to the Cosmos in San Diego. I don't remember much about the game. The thing I do remember is I thought this was brilliant. He reconfigured the Kingdom and called it the Soccer Dome. And he kind of lost the big vastness and pulled some seats in closer to the action. It made a huge difference both in the reality of the crowd and in how close, much more enjoyable it was to watch close. So I think we doubled. And then in the playoffs, we had big crowds. So nice little uptick, nice little effort. But Coluccios, for whatever reasons, they were done. And then the new ownership came in and the visions parted. John did not have the same vision as the new ownership. And it was quite easy for him just to bow out gracefully. And after going to Soccer Bowl. So won a championship, went to Soccer Bowl, and then left. Just being open to opportunity. A friend of ours, Ted White, lived in Tacoma. We were just like almost everybody in Seattle. We were aware of Tacoma, but I think John would go and speak there once in a while, but we just didn't have a clue. But what we did like was that new dome. We liked the Tacoma Dome. And John returned to his original desire to build a community around a team. he saw that that could happen in Tacoma. They got a new facility. They had no cachet themselves. And they were at a period in time where they were anxious to become more. They had a program called New Beginnings, which actually dovetailed with the Stars coming there. So Ted White, I don't know how he knew John. Well, probably followed the story of him leaving the Sounders at that time. But he approached us about a franchise, but he didn't know what kind. But at that time, Kenny Cooper, who played goalkeeper with John in Dallas, was the coach of a very successful franchise called the Baltimore Blast. And Kenny got on John big time, along with the Liwiki boys, who continually have something to do around here, from Kansas City. And then Earl Foreman was the commissioner. And so through Ted White, he introduced us to a lot of people. And basically, Frank, we got the same quality of ownership in Tacoma that we had in Seattle and in Vancouver. These were the people who cared about that community, who wanted it to be more, have more pride in itself, to be more active, not to just be second city. We got that great ownership group. And then we had the competition between MISL, which was Earl Foreman and the Liwikis and Kenny Cooper and that group. And Dallas had a franchise too. A competition as to who was going to get to play indoor soccer, a game no one had ever seen before, much like the original Sounders. Indoor soccer in the Tacoma Dome. And eventually, I've said this to you before, you know, it really was Tacoma's decision to step out and be on their own and not just be a secondary team to the Seattle Sounders. So they took a chance. We got that franchise in August, and we played in November. Who we put on the field? Holy moly. I remember we had a Terry MacDonald, who was my PA announcer in Seattle and also PA announcer for the Seahawks. He came down, was going to be the PA announcer for the Stars, which was kind of cool. And Terry couldn't do a game one night, so we got a nice fellow off one of the radio stations there to do the broadcast and be the PA guy. And he literally said, "Number 10 is passing to number 6, and number 2 is coming off the bench." I mean, he literally, you can't get a franchise in August and put the big guys on the field in November. But everybody was excited about it. It was a new facility and a new game. And so there was no other players. They were just these players. Well, it took a while. It was the third year when we outdrew the Sonics, by the way, in 2 of the years we were there, the last 2 years. The year we almost won the championship, and then the year after that. John, same vision. Grow Tacoma, make its community and its team, higher profile, more major league. Same vision, except different game. We actually liked indoor soccer a lot. And he recruited again. He was a great recruiter, great putting together of the puzzle of players. And we had a fine indoor soccer team. Of course, we got Steve Jungle, who was called the Lord of all Indoors. And he was a very quirky person, but a one-of-a-kind player. Precky, who went on to have a big career. And we had the Neil and Ralph Black and Joey Waters and Mike Dowler. We put together a good team, and of course, we almost won the championship. Brought Alan back as coach. Alan worked for John 3 times. Anyway, again, I would say very successful. We did not win the championship that year, but Tacoma had a big parade downtown, ticker tape and everything, and the players ran through, and they got, well, like I said, we outdrew the Sonics. They got on national TV. It did grow the community. And that was a fun bunch of fans. They were really into it. They were kind of like the game itself. It was different than soccer, although the skills were very similar, but the game was so different. But it was a rock'em sock'em game, and so were those fans. They had little clumps of fans all over, named themselves and wore costumes, and they probably never sold so many merchandise with stars on it as they did during those years. I myself purchased many. But it was really the very same values: entertaining, community building, team being the most important, not individuals, all the same values.